Good evening, and welcome to Tea Talks, the myths, the truths, and the untold stories of the Boston Tea Party. My name is Kelly Harangalanti, and I am on the creative team here at the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum. Tonight's topic brings us the story of one of Boston's most famous sons and one of my favorite artists, John Singleton Copley. Now, I'm going to be real with you right now. I am a huge fan of Copley's works, and honestly, the reason why I am here tonight giving this presentation, is because of a chance meeting at least 10 years ago with this. Watson and the Shark. At 6 feet high and 7.5 feet long, it is an imposing figure on a dark teal wall with a bench directly in front of it in the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Now, at this point, I cannot tell you how many times I've sat on that exact bench and communed with Watson and the Shark. I think I was initially drawn to the size of it, the harrowing scene taking place, and obviously to the shark. Like, look at the shark. Look at it. It has lips, okay? This shark just enamored me. So each time I visited this painting, I began to pick up on other details, and it also caused me to start to look more closely at the other works on this floor and began to realize that a lot of them are all by the same guy. And it was around this time that I was beginning to learn who the subjects of these portraits were and how they fit into our colonial world here at the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum surrounding our opening in 2012. But this piece spoke to me. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to think about it, and I questioned if my opinions were valid, but I couldn't deny how it made me feel. I wanted to know more about it. I wanted to know what was happening more than what is printed on the little placard on the wall. And you can only imagine my excitement when I found out that there are 3 of these, and the one that I was looking at in Boston wasn't even the original. I will also fully admit that I traveled to Washington, D.C. several years ago with the express purpose of seeing the original in the National Gallery. And of course, I was internally squeeing the entire time and was wondering how people could just wander by without stopping. But here I am, almost 10 years after seeing this painting for the first time, in a position to give this talk tonight and to introduce you to my old friend, John Singleton Copley. Now, of course, going to an art museum can be daunting, especially if you feel as if you don't know enough about art to be there. I once felt the same way, but I was lucky enough to be very close to the creation of an invaluable tool to help combat those art museum jitters. And tonight, I am delighted to be joined by a very special guest, the creator and host of the popular art history podcast, The Lonely Palette, and dear friend of mine, Tamar Avishai. Each episode of The Lonely Palette, Tamar picks an object du jour, interviews unsuspecting passersby in front of it, and then dives deeply into the movement, the social context, the anecdotes, and anything and everything else that will make it as exciting to you as it is to her. We're going to take the guesswork out of examining a portrait, and hopefully you'll learn to trust that what you're seeing is exactly right. Now, if you've ever visited Boston, and even some of you that live here, you might be familiar with Copley Square. But you might have no idea who Copley actually is. Now, perhaps you visited the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and come face to face with his works. And additionally, the Fairmount Copley Plaza Hotel and their most famous and adorable resident, Corey Copley in Boston, bear his name, as do Copley Township, Summit County, Ohio, and maybe most interesting of all, the Copley crater on Mercury is named after him in 1976. Now, in honor of the 150th anniversary of Copley's death in 1965, the U.S. Postal Service issued a 5-cent stamp commemorating the occasion. The image featured his daughter, Elizabeth Clark Copley, in his painting, The Copley Family of 1776. And he gives us a beautiful and stylized window into the colonial era in Boston, having painted many of our patriot heroes, in addition to many members of the merchant elite class, military officers, and a good number of loyalists. Many Bostonians, especially merchants and tradesmen, were not firmly set on one side of the political spectrum until much later than we might expect. These individuals were concerned with their financial interests first and foremost. In a 1770 letter to American artist Benjamin West, Copley writes, I am desirous of avoiding every imputation of party spirit, political contest being neither pleasing to an artist or advantageous to the art itself. John Singleton Copley, known as Jack, was born in 1738 to Richard Copley and Mary Singleton. They had immigrated to Boston in 1736 from Ireland. Well, very little survives of Richard, but we do know that Mary ran a tobacco shop out of their small three-room wooden home along Boston's Long Wharf. Now, due to poor health, Richard relocated without his family to the West Indies, looking for a warmer climate. He ultimately died there in the mid-1740s. Now, being an important port city in the early 1700s, Boston was responsible for around 40% of all of the shipping to the American colonies. Imports included textiles, ceramics, glass, flour, sugar, rum, tea, nails, tools, and paper, while major exports included codfish, lumber, pitch, tar, beef, pork, and furs. Now today, Boston's Long Wharf is still in use, being the main docking area for the city cruises, the location of the famous Chart House restaurant, the Marriott Long Wharf Hotel, and of course, the New England Aquarium. This location would have served a young Copley well, as he was able to experience the mercantile life firsthand. Now, in 1748, Mary Singleton Copley married engraver, schoolteacher, and artist Peter Pelham. They moved about half a mile up King Street, today's State Street, closer to the center of town on Lindell's or Lendell's Row. Today, this is known as Exchange Place in the financial district. In 1749, Copley's half-brother, Henry Pelham, known as Harry, was born. Mary continued her tobacco business in her new home, while her husband advertised instruction in English manners, reading, writing, arithmetic, needlework, dancing, painting on glass, and French. But surprisingly enough, he did not advertise his skill of engraving, though his legacy of an artist was through the mezzotint, which is a method of engraving a metal plate by systematically and evenly pricking its entire surface with innumerable small holes that will hold ink and, when printed, produce large areas of tone. Though Peter Pelham died in 1751, in their 3-year relationship, he likely introduced his stepson to the mezzotint and encouraged his artistic development. He may have also taught his son the art of self-marketing. Now, one of Pelham's greatest successes was his mezzotint of Puritan Reverend Cotton Mather in 1728. He assured his subscribers of the likeness, offered financing plans, and also offered bonuses for bulk purchases. He continued to employ these ideas in his mezzotint business until his death. Now, as he entered into his late teens and early 20s, in the mid to late 1750s, Copley's impressive skill had already garnered the attention of Boston's merchant and professional class, who were seeking the best that money could buy. More than 60% of his portraits were commissioned for merchants, large landowners, lawyers, and physicians. In the decade following the conclusion of the French and Indian War, money began to move into the hands of the merchants, as the lower and middling classes were making most purchases on credit, as paper currency and specie were rare in the colonies. Real estate and goods were the only true capital, and that left many people in perpetual debt. The rich were getting richer, and the poor were getting poorer. The Puritan ideals of the previous century were falling away as the colonists were making a show of their wealth, especially in the form of a John Singleton Copley portrait for their home. The Boston elite were not necessarily interested in art for the beauty of it, but for what it conveyed regarding their financial status. These portraits showed off one's position in society, as the props, the clothing, the objects, or the background scenes would assert an affirmation of character and class. But in looking at his works, we also need to keep in mind that Copley was a dream seller and would help the sitter achieve the lifestyle or look that they wanted. Clothing, fabric, and other consumer goods were often more important in colonial portraiture than postures and faces, although Jack was very skilled at those. As he gains prominence as an artist, our friend Mr. Copley also dreams of this affluent lifestyle. His insatiable nature regarding material goods would follow him throughout his life, and certainly contributed to his being heavily in debt upon his death. In 1763, an exclusive merchants club was created, which showed not only the connection through business alliances, economics, and political power, but also through marriage and blood relation. As wealth grew in the colonies, Anglophilia, or a love of the goods and lifestyles in England, grew as well. This ideal also began to draw a divide between artistic works produced in America versus those produced in London or Europe as a whole. American artists weren't considered to be great until they embarked upon European tours to see the great masters and until they began to create larger scale historical or religious paintings. In the introduction of her book, A Revolution in Color, The World of John Singleton Copley, Jane Kamensky writes that Boston was a place to paint small, to paint faces. These paintings were intended for the walls of homes, not for the large exhibition halls in London or other great cities in Europe. Now, 1764 brought the death of wealthy Boston merchant Thomas Hancock. His nephew John inherits the profitable merchant business, the House of Hancock, in addition to Hancock Manor on Beacon Hill. John had been a partner in the business for at least a year at the time of his uncle's death, and had been living the life of an aristocrat and had an affinity for colorful and fancy clothing. Now, he commissioned this portrait by Copley in 1765. This portrait displays a much more subdued John Hancock than the town of Boston was used to seeing. He is seated, wearing a rather plain and practical dark blue suit with a business ledger and seems to be deep in thought. His true status within the community is not fully communicated in this piece. Some historians believe that he wanted to show a more serious side of himself as he began his political career. His influence in town begins to grow throughout the turbulence caused by the various acts implemented by Parliament on the American colonies. He was elected as a Boston selectman in 1765 and would join the Massachusetts House of Representatives in 1766. The Stamp Act was put into place in 1765 in an effort to raise revenue to alleviate the British Empire's excessive debt from the French and Indian War. This first direct tax required a stamp to be affixed to any and all paper goods, newspapers, legal documents, marriage licenses, death certificates, receipts, etc. In Boston, there was a sense of unity among the merchants who were taking part in these non-importation agreements, and many who were on the same page at this point in time would find themselves on opposing sides less than a decade later. In early 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed. Now, this year also saw Copley sending his A Boy with a Flying Squirrel to exhibition in London. This portrait featured his stepbrother Harry and was his first to be exhibited abroad. And this portrait now hangs in the Art of the Americas wing at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. So Captain R.G. Bruce of the merchant vessel John and Suki was responsible for the transport of this piece. He wrote to Copley in August of that same year with the thoughts of Sir Joshua Reynolds, the renowned English artist, regarding his work. That he did not know one painter at home who had all the advantages that Europe could give them, that could equal it, and that if you are capable of producing such a piece by the mere efforts of your own genius, with the advantages of the example and instruction which you could have in Europe, you would be a valuable acquisition to the art and one of the first painters in the world, provided you could receive these aids before it was too late in life and before your manner and taste were corrupted or fixed by working in your little way at Boston. He condemns your working either in crayons or watercolors. It is a wonderful picture to be sent by a young man who was never out of New England and had only some bad copies to study. Though encouraging, Reynolds' thoughts were also a bit condescending and furthered the thought that artists could only succeed if they studied in Europe. Also enclosed in Captain Bruce's letter was the first correspondence from the American artist Benjamin West to our Mr. Copley. West also encourages Jack to embark on a European tour, writing, "As I am from America and know the little opportunities is to be had there in the way of painting, made the inducement the more in writing to you in this manner. And as you have got to that length in the art, that nothing is wanting to perfect you now but a sight of what has been done by the great masters. And if you could make a visit to Europe for this purpose for 3 or 4 years, you would find yourself then in possession of what will be highly valuable. If ever you should make a visit to Europe, you may depend upon my friendship in any way that's in my power to serve." Now, West was known for his historical paintings and definitely had the fame which Copley so desperately sought. After the successful exhibition of his piece, at the age of 27, Jack was elected to the Society of Artists in London. And though he was beginning to find the professional success that he so deeply craved, he was living through a tumultuous time. Parliament enacted the Townshend Acts in 1767, which taxed paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. And as an artist, this new tax definitely would have affected Jack in his quest for supplies. In late 1767, in a protest of these newly implemented acts, over 650 Boston citizens signed on to the new non-importation, non-consumption agreements, and John Singleton Copley was one of them. His future brother-in-law, Jonathan Clark, was amongst the names on the list as well. Now, this list of names is not merely Sons of Liberty or those of a more patriot leaning, and in fact, some now very recognizable patriots were not found on this list at all. Throughout all of this, he continued to paint, although only 5 paintings can be firmly dated to 1768, and one of which is the iconic Paul Revere portrait. Revere had been commissioned by 15 patrons to complete the Wilkes and Liberty Punch Bowl in the same year, and his ledgers show a man bringing in meager wages, which certainly begs the question how and why he would have sat for Copley. It would have taken over half of his yearly income to procure a portrait from the famed artist. Now, he had worked with Jack in the past, creating cases for his mezzotints, and so maybe this was a barter between the two artists. But this particular portrait was very different from Copley's usual works, as this subject was dressed very casually in a work shirt, open waistcoat, unwigged, and sitting with the instruments of his trade. His usual clientele was seeking upward mobility with the help of their portrait, while this image shows us a working class individual. And this working class image of Paul Revere is certainly in stark contrast to one of Copley's sitters of the same year, General Thomas Gage. After years of unrest and intimidation of government officials, Governor Francis Bernard requests British military presence in Boston, and in the fall of 1768, the soldiers stepped foot onto American soil. Jack hosted General Gage's aides at a levee or a fashionable dinner shortly thereafter. Now, Gage was only in Boston for a short 5 weeks from October 15th to November 24th, and yet he made it a priority to sit for a portrait. Interestingly enough, Gage's staff and his wife Margaret were amongst 13 of the subscribers who make it possible for Copley to travel to New York City in 1771 for the express purpose of producing more stunning portraits. In 1768, Copley makes a substantial land purchase on Beacon Hill, adjacent to John Hancock's estate, which would later be referred to as Mount Pleasant by the Copleys. The cost was equivalent to 6 months behind the easel. Now, this was most likely in preparation for his impending nuptials with Susanna Farnham Clark, the daughter of wealthy merchant Richard Clark and his wife Elizabeth. Elizabeth was not only related to 2 of the most well-connected and politically powerful families in Boston, the Olivers and the Hutchinsons, but her lineage also extended back to the Mayflower. On November 16th, 1769, Jack and Suki, as she was known to her friends and family, were married at the Brattle Square Meeting House. Her family worshipped there alongside Samuel Adams and James Otis Jr. Now, upon the occasion of her marriage, there was a transfer of the bride's fortune from her father to her husband. And as Jane Kamensky mentions in her book, if Mount Pleasant was the estate that Suki's portion of the Clark fortune built, then Copley's grand house rested upon tea leaves. Now, besides immense amount of tea, it must be noted that Richard Clark's merchant house sold commodities that were produced by enslaved peoples in the Carolinas and the Caribbean. We know that Suki grew up with enslaved people under her roof, and after her marriage, 3 of those individuals, a woman named Lucy, a man named Cato, and a child named Snap, moved into her new household on Cambridge Street and later to Mount Pleasant on Beacon Hill. And this would be the first time that Copley had enslaved peoples under his own roof. Now, early 1770 was a tense time in Boston. On February 22nd, a young boy named Christopher Sider was killed by Ebenezer Richardson as he attempted to fight off a mob at his door. Only 2 weeks later, on March 5th, 5 individuals were killed in an event now known as the Boston Massacre, following several days of brawling. The morning after brought thousands of people to Faneuil Hall, and people with information stepped forward with their accounts. Jack, Suki, and his stepbrother, Harry Pelham, had heard a soldier to say that the devil might give quarters, he should give them none. Several others corroborated this account, and it was deemed that the inhabitants of the town and the soldiers can no longer dwell together in safety. The soldiers were removed to Castle William. Now, Harry quickly set work to create an original artistic print showing the events of the bloody massacre on King Street. He created the drawing, cut the plate, and contracted with a printer to buy hundreds of sheets of paper. Now, he opened the Boston Gazette on March 26th and saw that Paul Revere had stolen his image. It was known that Paul Revere had the skill to engrave the scene, but not necessarily to sketch it. Revere had the printers of the Gazette, Benjamin Eads and John Gill, to thank for the forceful promotion of his now famous version. It's not entirely known how Paul came into possession of the image, but in a letter from Harry to Paul, he does say, "As I thought I had entrusted it in the hands of a person who had more regard to the dictates of honor and justice than to take the undue advantage you had done of the confidence and trust I had reposed in you." The two knew each other, and it is possible that Harry had shown it to Paul or was seeking help in the engraving. This image would have certainly cemented Pelham's names in our history books, but alas, he has become more of a footnote than anything. Now, it is likely that Jack began the portrait of Samuel Adams in this same year. This portrait was most likely commissioned by John Hancock, as it hung in his home for many years, and because he could afford it, while Mr. Adams could not. Apparently, a descendant of Adams claimed that Copley was a great admirer of Samuel Adams and undertook con amore the task of transferring his features to canvas. This seems like a dubious statement, as Jack painted for a living. He painted for money, and it's not entirely certain how he felt about Adams at the time of this portrait, but a few years later, Jack wrote to Peter Oliver stating that if he wished to draw a picture of the devil, that he would get Samuel Adams to sit for him. But don't you worry, we're going to take a deeper look at this portrait when Tamar joins me in just a little while. And so Jack and Suki spend the latter half of 1771 in New York City, where he completes an astounding 37 portraits, including Margaret Gage, wife of General Thomas Gage. Now, Jack was able to charge considerably higher rates in New York City than in Boston, fetching 40 guineas for a full length, which is the modern equivalent of $7,600. He could receive 20 guineas for a half and 10 for a bust size or a Kit Kat. Now, he also found New York City to be quite fashionable and sent many letters to Harry requesting further changes to the ongoing renovations at Mount Pleasant. He earns an incredible 1,000 guineas in this year, a modern equivalent of almost $200,000, certainly the highest earnings of his career. Now, in late 1772, Jack begins to plan his European tour in earnest. His brother-in-law Jonathan arrives in London and encourages him to embark on this tour alone and for a length of 18 to 24 months. Now, though things have been relatively quiet since the Boston Massacre of 1770, early 1773 brings the Tea Act, in which Parliament grants the East India Company the ability to ship directly to the American colonies and places the tea tax originally put into place under the Townshend Acts back into the forefront of people's minds. Meanwhile, in June, Jack borrows £600 against his land holdings on Beacon Hill and excuses himself from the clerk of the market position, as he'd be leaving the province for some time for his European tour. In August, the family learns that Jonathan has secured a consignment with the East India Company for the tea being shipped to Boston, an original total of 600 chests of tea. Now, the fall brings the birth of Copley's daughter Mary and her baptism on October 17th. Now, the following day, the Boston Gazette publicly admonishes Richard Clark and the other East India Company consignees. And 10 days later, Clark takes to the more conservative newspaper in town to defend himself. But we must remember, at this time, Richard Clark was not a staunch loyalist, nor was he a member of the Patriot cause. He was a businessman through and through. And for those of you that had watched some of our previous Tea Talks, some of the following bits of our timeline might be familiar to you. So on November 2nd, a letter is delivered to the Clark home, demanding the resignation of the consignees at the Liberty Tree the following day. Of course, they don't show up, but the mob decides to pay them a visit at Clark's warehouse. Now, 2 weeks later, Jonathan arrives home in Boston aboard the ship Haley after an extended stay in London. Now, side note, this ship set sail on the very same day as the tea-laden vessels headed to Boston, but she managed to break out of the English Channel ahead of them, and so we know that the tea is on its way. Now, with Jonathan's return, the Clark family were gathered in celebration, and it's highly likely that Jack and Suki were present at the Clark home when the mob, well, came a-knocking, or should I say, violently pounding. So following this attack, the family disperses for their own safety. Richard Clark heads north to stay with his sister's family in Salem. His daughter Lucy moves to the Copley home on Beacon Hill, and sons Jonathan and Isaac go to Castle William. Now, on November 28th, 1773, the first of the Boston-bound tea ships arrives in the outer harbor. On the morning of November 29th, a broadside is posted all around town, calling all to the town meeting at 9 a.m. at Faneuil Hall to discuss the arrival of the tea. And remember, this sets in motion the 20-day window in which the ship owner has to pay the duties upon the cargo. Now, the number of attendees grew to be too much for Faneuil Hall, and thus the meeting was moved to Old South Meeting House, what will be a common occurrence in the coming weeks. Samuel Adams and John Hancock held the floor for most of the day, but at one point, John Singleton Copley became the de facto spokesperson for the family, as Richard, Jonathan, and Isaac were barricaded at Castle William. Jack was asked to make his way to the castle to speak with the Clarks when the meeting was adjourned until the following morning. Now, if Copley were traveling over in that direction in the modern day, he would have had a much easier time getting there. But in 1773, Castle Island was actually an island. He would have either taken the longer water route from Long Wharf or had to go down the land route to Dorchester Flats and then secured passage on a small boat for the short distance to the castle. He spoke with the men and encouraged them to send something to the town's selectmen. And for some reason, he didn't peek at this letter until he had gotten back to land. And he found that they had flat out refused the people's demands. And so he returned to ask them to produce something a bit softer in tone to avoid any further conflagration. Now, in a letter to Boston Selectman John Scalay, the consignees said that it was utterly out of their power to send back the cargo, although they did offer to store the tea until they received further instruction from the East India Company. Scalay relayed the message to the body of the people as the meeting reconvened the next morning. Copley attended and asked the people for some civility, and that if he were to convince the Clarks and others to appear, that they would be treated well. He requests 2 hours of leave to go back to the castle to appeal to the family. He, of course, takes much longer than 2 hours, and when he finally does return, he does so alone, but with a message. The men pledged to make no attempt to sell the tea. A letter exists in the Copley Pelham papers from Jack to Jonathan and Isaac following his return to the meeting. In this letter, he lets them know that Cousin Harry has been sent to Salem to retrieve their father Richard, and that he'll be arriving at the castle that same day. He also mentions that he had a long and free conversation with Dr. Warren following the meeting, and that they would renew it that afternoon with John Hancock in attendance. Now, he goes on to give advice to the Clarks to avoid talking to Governor Hutchinson, saying, "I think it is the best advice I can give, both as a friend to you and him. My reasons for it I will tell you when I see you." Now, perhaps he believes that the distance between them would be wise, so as not to be seen as receiving special treatment from the governor, who also happens to be Richard Clark's uncle. Now, if they're in cahoots with the governor, there's no way the Sons of Liberty will take them seriously, and they'll probably end up destroying their house. Again. Now, the tension in town continues to mount as the ship Eleanor arrives in Boston Harbor on December 2nd, with the brig Beaver arriving in the outer harbor on December 7th. That same day, Francis Roach, owner of the Dartmouth and Beaver, and Captain Hall traveled to the castle to speak with the consignees. They inform the consignees that they are prepared to deliver the tea. However, the tea agents now refuse to accept it or pay for delivery. Meanwhile, Francis Roach is being pressed by the Boston Committee of Correspondence to request a pass to allow his ships to return to London. And of course, the customs officials tell him that he will not receive a pass until the duties are paid. So, after their refusals, it seems as though the body of the people and the committees change tactics and continue to push Francis Roach while seemingly not bothering to check in with the consignees any further. Now, on December 10th, the William, the fourth Boston-bound ship, runs aground in Provincetown at the tip of Cape Cod with 58 tea chests on board. Now, on December 16th, Jonathan Clark rides to Provincetown to survey the wreckage of the William. Now, as you can see, this work is named Henry Pelham or Jonathan Clark. And, well, since we've talked about both of these men tonight, I figured it'd be okay to use this. So, anyway, Jonathan finds that the majority of the tea that had been severely damaged, 2 chests of it were salvaged and stored in Provincetown. 2 sloops are chartered to transport the other cargoes from the William to Boston, which includes nearly 300 street lamps for public use. And meanwhile, the tea is taken to Castle Island aboard a Salem fishing schooner, the Eunice, captained by John Cook. Now, it arrives on January 4th, but was not unloaded until January 6th, as the consignees had to decide what to do with it. The consignees ultimately refuse it, and the customs officers seize it and store it at the castle. But from there, history loses track of it. But it is believed that during the siege of Boston, British soldiers brought the tea ashore for sale and consumption, though no record of the tax ever being paid exists. Now, as many of you may remember, the body of the people spends that same day, December 16th, at Old South Meeting House, attempting to come to a resolution before the 20-day deadline expires on the 17th. Francis Roche is sent to visit Governor Hutchinson in Milton one last time to request a pass for the ships after many failed attempts to find a suitable solution. Governor Hutchinson refuses, and when Roche brings this news to the meeting, Samuel Adams stands up and proclaims, "There is nothing more a meeting can do to save this country." And a good number of men begin to exit the meeting house, and as we know, between 100 and 150 men arrive at Griffin's Wharf. They board the 3 vessels and destroy 340 chests of East India Company tea. In the spring of 1774, the news of the passage of the first part of the Coercive Acts, the Boston Port Bill, arrived in town. This bill will close Boston Harbor until the King's Treasury received restitution for lost duties and the East India Company was compensated for damages of lost tea at Griffin's Wharf. Now, Boston is a port city and relies heavily on imports from London and other cities. This move will effectively put a stranglehold on the local economy and will affect all merchants, not just those of the Patriot persuasion. And on May 13th, 1774, General Thomas Gage is installed as the new governor of Massachusetts, and martial law is implemented. A statement circulated throughout the town praising outgoing Governor Thomas Hutchinson's work and his dealings with the tea crisis. Only 123 people signed this document, and John Singleton Copley was one of them. Perhaps he felt if he signed, he would curry some favor from the former governor once he finally arrived in London. And just a few weeks later, on June 10th, Copley sailed to London aboard the ship Thomas. Copley sailed alone, leaving his wife, mother, and children under the charge of his stepbrother Harry. He was finally embarking upon his European tour. Now, what they didn't know at the time was that Suki was pregnant with their 4th child, and so she would not leave Boston until May of 1775. Their 4th child, Clark, was born in January of 1775, but was most likely deemed too young or too sickly to make the journey. This painting, The Copley Family, includes this child, whom Jack will never actually see with his own eyes, as Clark dies in Boston a few days after his first birthday in January of 1776. With the family removed from Boston, the British troops claimed Mount Pleasant, having first taken the fence for firewood. Now, Richard Clark and his son Isaac joined Jonathan in London in December of 1775, and Harry finally departed Boston for Halifax, Nova Scotia on Evacuation Day, March 17, 1776. John Singleton Copley, America's finest portrait painter, never stepped foot on American soil again. Over his 60-year career, 20 years in Boston and another 40 in London, he produced around 350 works of art. After completing his European tour and studying the works of the great masters of his craft, he began to paint the larger historical or religious paintings that were so respected at this time. He yearned for the fame and fortune that Benjamin West and Joshua Reynolds had achieved, and his taste for the finer things in life never truly abated. Upon his death in 1815, Suki was left to deal with the very large debts left behind. Whew! Well, now that I have given you a pretty thorough rundown of Jack's early life in Boston and his connection to the Boston Tea Party, perhaps it's time that we bring in Tamar and maybe have some fun. So let's see here. All right, there she is. Hi, Tamar.
Hi.
All right, welcome. I am so excited to see you. This is going to be a great time. So why don't you take it away?
Okay. Wow. I should add, by the way, that I actually drove through Summit County today. So
Did you?
as a recent transplant from Boston to Shaker Heights, Ohio, it's nice to bring a little piece of my hometown with me.
That is amazing. Had I known, I would have made you stop and take a photo somewhere. Like, that's pretty cool.
It's lovely. A lot of trees. So I wanted to actually, like, as I was listening, I was just thinking about a lot of different threads that could be really interesting to pull on a little bit and think about in terms of why we are drawn to art. You know, I mean, you can put so much emphasis on the history and the context of a specific artist. And it's funny, like art historians are always asked, like, who's your favorite artist? And it's like, that's like asking a forest what its favorite tree is. You know, it's just, you don't actually deep dive into, at least not somebody who kind of, I have always tended to teach a lot of art history survey courses. And so it's a lot of how different movements connect to each other and kind of historically are in conversation with each other, and less about that kind of specificity about one artist. It's actually very, very interesting and very educational to learn that much about Copley. But what I wanted to start with actually is both the image of you sitting in front of Watson and the Shark and having this moment of connection and excitement around a painting that first it pulls you in, and then you learn a lot more about it, and then you seek it out. And it's like the first thing is kind of involuntary, and then you voluntarily keep going. And that's actually what a lot of art historians tend to do. You know, it's like you can always, you know, it starts with a painting or two, and from there, it's like you want to learn more about it. And then the more you learn about it, the more you want to know. And that actually, as an art history podcaster, has kind of kept me employed because it's like people do, you know, one painting or another will kind of catch their eye. And then once you learn more about it, you feel this incredible sense of ownership and excitement over it. And so art, which is something that I think we can all agree, even me as an art historian, can be kind of intimidating. You know, and art museums specifically can feel kind of intimidating because, you know, you walk in and there's this like beautiful, intimidating silence from the high ceilings and the squeaky floors. And you kind of feel like there's an expectation that you're not really allowed in unless you know something. That's one thing. Another part of it is, okay, you know, so I'm going to stand in front of a painting and where's the lightning striking that's going to pull me to it. And that doesn't always happen. You know, sometimes it does. And a lot of times it doesn't, especially if you're like trying to force it. And so you can end up walking around a museum and feeling like if you weren't prepped in advance, you know, how is it going to speak to me? And I love the idea of that painting speaking to you, because I have to say, it's never like particularly done anything for me other than me knowing that you love it. And so like, I'll stop in front of it, and I've even stopped in front of it with you. And you have pointed out parts of it that have been really exciting. And it's made me see it through new eyes. And one thing that I want to be very clear about is that this idea of like looking at art through someone else's eyes, like as an art historian, I want to be really clear that I don't look at a painting and see anything different than what anybody would see. And I think that, again, that kind of taps into the intimidation factor, that it's like, if I look at something, I must be like connecting to like a secret handshake. And it's not true. Art, especially art like this, and we're going to talk about this painting. But there's a great kind of cheeky truism about art, that all art has been contemporary. I've seen that like outside of contemporary art museums, but also outside of ancient art museums. And I think that that's actually where that belongs. So this idea that all art has been contemporary, I think recalibrates the way that, we walk by these objects. We know that they're important, we know that they're significant, we know that they're very expensive, that you're not supposed to touch them. And they're surrounded by these beautiful ornate frames that really almost like separate them from us because they belong to the ages.
Right.
And so we have this feeling that it happened in the past, and you forget that this painting, and we'll focus specifically on this painting of Samuel Adams by Copley, was painted for its audience. And its contemporary audience would have read this in a very specific way. And Copley knew exactly what to put into it that was going to speak to his audience in a very specific way. And what makes this painting kind of exceptional is that the same tips and tricks that were at his disposal, kind of in his tool chest, are actually working on us too. And that's why this is a great painting. That's why this is a painting not just in its moment, but kind of also belonging to the ages. Because if you really take some time and give this painting its like necessary time to look at it, then you're going to also be a little bit like, okay, Mr. Adams, whatever you say, in a way that, you have to think like, we are not part of this historical moment, but, there's something very powerful happening here. And before we actually get into our kind of all play, because I'm going to be asking our participants to start us off in terms of what about this painting kind of speaks to them. I just want to be very clear too, that painting is very political, not just a political painting like this, but the ways that we kind of connect to our popular culture and the ways that we're part of the conversation. It's like the frame disappears, the glass between the canvas and the audience just disappears. And so to walk into a museum and feel intimidated as though like there's a secret knock that you're not allowed. I mean, just imagine that this is a political cartoon, that is actually kind of speaking to you, and that these are real people depicted and real people painting it. And they didn't necessarily have degrees in art history, like it was still speaking to them because it was incredibly immediate. And I love the story about what Adams must have been like to pose for Copley, because actually Hancock himself didn't like Samuel Adams very much, and really commissioned the portrait as a means of kind of like upping his like cred with the Sons of Liberty, so that he would have this hanging in his salon, living room, in his home. So that when there were meetings, he was kind of like staking his claim. And so it's like, even this painting that you walk into the MFA and it's like, it's an important painting. It was painted for political purposes. And we can all relate to that in a way that, again, you don't need a degree in art history to be able to actually like understand how human beings interact with each other. Right. And so often art is the byproduct of those soulful, petty, poignant interactions between human beings. Sure. All art has been contemporary in its moment. So, okay, but I want to open it up to our audience, because now that you've had some time to really look at this painting, I just want to ask you, what do you see that strikes you about this painting? How, and especially because we've just looked at actually a number of other portraits, and there's something a little different about this one. And I'm not looking for a specific answer. I'm just, there is a dynamism here. There's a way that he is depicted, that if you really focus on the details, I kind of, I want to know what you see that strikes you as particularly interesting, particularly surprising or kind of unexpected about this painting.
Right. So go ahead in the chat, everybody. Use our chat function for this. We will use the Q&A function in a little while, but in the chat, just go ahead and say some stuff. And I know this is really scary, and you're probably sitting there just like, I don't know what I'm
there's
seeing.
no wrong answer here.
Right.
And in fact, if you come out with like the historically correct answer, I'm not going to read it out loud because you're cheating.
Right. We know this is Sam Adams, but
yeah.
But looking at that painting, what are you seeing?
Okay, definitely the pointing hand. Good.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, in that vein, keep it going. His expression is curious. Be more specific, actually. What about it? What do you mean by curious? Simplicity. What is he thinking? Okay. All red. True. Good. Hang on, let me go to.
Anything else? Anybody see anything else?
Okay, this is a good start. If you have anything else. That is the Massachusetts Charter. That feels a little cheaty. Okay. An open book. Yeah, book. I mean, books in general, like the objects that are here. And I mean, what Kelly said earlier about portraiture, this affirmation of character and class, if this is what portraiture was meant to be, how does this portrait sit in this larger idea of what we think portraiture is? His face expresses determination. Good. So okay, this is great. Again, this idea that we're all looking at the same thing. This is a painting that is basically a piece of propaganda. And we associate propaganda with, something, with a kind of, biased narrative, biased storytelling, like, something that we don't necessarily connect with fine art. You think that fine art is weirdly kind of neutral because it belongs to the ages. And propaganda is trying to convince me of something. And so we have this kind of allergy to the idea of propaganda. And there's a wonderful quote by an incredible artist. He's a photo montagist. He was a Weimar period photo montagist. His name is John Hartfield. And he said that the purpose of propaganda is to make itself obsolete. I mean, if you are good propaganda, then you are doing such a good cause, such a good job pushing your cause that you're going to win, and then you won't need it anymore. And you don't necessarily associate that with a painting that belongs to the ages. So already you have this kind of juxtaposition between a beautiful, fine painting and a pushed political agenda. And what we're seeing in this painting, everything that you saw, everything that you see, you're supposed to see. And that is incredibly intentional. So just start with the pointing hand. Of course you see the pointing hand because the light is on it. There's an incredible amount of actually art historical convention that is telling us what to look at in this painting and basically how to feel about it. So where is the light hitting? His hand and his oversized head. That's something that you don't notice until you look at it, but his head is too big for his body. And there are some interesting kind of perspectival reasons for that. You can say this is actually an intentional, like on Copley's part, that he just made the head a little too big, but not so much that you'd notice, but that it feels intimidating. Or you could argue that maybe his head is actually a little bit forward. Either way, it's incredibly imposing. And so wherever this painting is hung, even if it's like below you, it feels like it's coming down on you. And the same thing with kind of the sharpness and like intentionality of that hand. So the head, the big head basically says, this is an intimidating figure who you should take seriously and is probably very smart because his head is so big, for the extra big brains. He wears this incredibly searing, intentional, piercing expression, as was mentioned in the chat. So this is not, the portrait of Hancock, kind of looking off into the distance and like dreaming big dreams. I mean, he is looking right at you. And this hand is pointing to, so one hand is wrapped around a petition, let's take a step back. This is supposed to be the day after the Boston Massacre. So we've just talked about the Boston Massacre and the fury that propaganda actually helped whip up. And this painting, it was painted 2 years later, but it was meant to depict the day after. And so this is Samuel Adams barging into Governor Hutchinson's office and basically saying, what the hell? Like, in contemporary terms. So
come on, man.
Yeah. Come on, man. So he's holding a petition signed by members by Boston citizens saying that they don't want this happening in their city. And he is pointing to the charter, right? Yep. So the charter that guarantees Massachusetts' independence, correct? Okay.
Yeah.
With the seal. So he is very clearly referencing images that, again, would probably have been very legible at the time. And basically saying, this aggression will not stand, man. He also, so those are the kind of key things that we're meant to see first, because of the way the light is hitting it. Then you're so kind of drawn in by the immediacy and the energy of this painting that, again, kind of speaks to us with the same amount of urgency as it would have spoken to its contemporary audience, which is what makes this, again, like really good propaganda, like really good timeless propaganda, which Hartfield would say can't even exist. It's so good. And the longer you look at it, the more you recognize that there are some other details here that are telling us other things. And this is actually where you can look at Copley's background as a trained painter. He himself, by the time you get to 19th century, I mean, this is late 18th, but, by the time you get to the turn of the 19th century, you have artists who are very aware of where they came from an art historical perspective. And so they're looking back and they're like borrowing from different old masters, from different styles, and using it to make as big a punch as they can with their work. And especially a fine artist who would have been interested in politics and really wanted to speak to his own moment with as much urgency as possible. So what is he going to borrow from? So he borrows from neoclassicism, from, kind of a few generations before. And you can see from the background, which only really kind of come into focus when you look at them, the columns. So you have these Greco-Roman columns in the background, and the way that the light source is actually hitting is also very reminiscent of neoclassicism. And neoclassicism, again, very legible. This is a period that is about the Enlightenment. It's about, about the rule of law, about rationalism. All of this anger is coming from actually a very rational place. And if you're looking at that and you're absorbing this painting, then like you can't help but like agree with him, because how could he be wrong? He has all of, the classics, like not only in his background, but in his big head.
Right.
And, that's kind of how we're meant to read this.
Sure.
And at the same time, that kind of takes care of the intellectual side of this painting, which again, very legible. What's also very sensational and kind of emotional when you're experiencing this painting is how much he feels like he's in our faces. And that is actually pulled from Baroque convention. That would have been Copley looking back at Caravaggio, looking back at artists who were often painting, not necessarily overtly political, but biblical scenes that are extremely emotional. And this was a response to the kind of staid humanist Renaissance where, and art history is just this big pendulum swinging back and forth from, one extreme to the other. And the response to what was a very kind of linear, mathematical, again, kind of human scale of the Renaissance was to be like, okay, now that we know how to paint things so with such accuracy and such precision, now like make them feel it. And so you have these very dark backgrounds and that really push the action forward. And you start to feel like the frame has all but fallen away. And you are suddenly in Christ's tomb with him. You are feeling the arm, Christ's arm, kind of almost limply falling into your space. It's incredibly powerful. And so again, Copley is looking at the old masters and picking and choosing elements from art that is going to make this as powerful a painting as possible. And one last thing, and I actually just saw something about his suit.
Yeah, Judith asks a good question here. She's asking, is his scarlet suit representing the blood of the massacre, or would it be a normal color for a suit?
I actually don't know. I don't want to speak out of turn because I don't actually know if that factored in.
Yeah,
it's certainly it's certainly striking.
Right. It is very striking. I do not believe that the choice of red in this was to represent the massacre. It is a color that was available for clothing. And so it could have just been, this outfit was, we believe, at least, some of the tales and things that we've heard is that Hancock purchased this suit for him, to be able to look a little better, elevated society, things like that, and to start to change the idea of the Sons of Liberty being this ragtag group and to try to turn them maybe into a little more gentlemanly society, but.
And yet, when you actually look at the way this suit is fitting him, you'll notice that the second two buttons are not buttoned, that the collar is a little rumpled. And when you can actually go closer to the painting itself, it's a little hard to see on the screen, but go to the MFA, you'll see it, that in some places the suit is actually stained. And that also is a very deliberate choice on the part of Copley depicting Samuel Adams here, because to go back again to this idea of portraiture as idealizing somebody, where, if you are going to pose for a portrait, if you're going to hire a portrait artist, then you want to be captured at your best, both physically and metaphorically. You want to be surrounded by objects that show your class. You want to be seen as somebody who can afford the portrait. And and also maybe some objects around you that kind of speak to your personality, but like the best parts of it.
Right.
And what we're seeing here is Adam's looking a little schlubby. He's got, again, it's a little hard to see in the reproduction, but if you stand in front of the painting, you see that he actually has a 5 o'clock shadow. And he just doesn't look like somebody who particularly cares about his appearance, which is not something that we're used to seeing in a commissioned portrait. However, that exactly portrays who he is trying to be in this moment, because he doesn't care about his appearance. That's how angry he is.
Right.
And to turn, that symbolism is really, really interesting. Because he is, it's entirely calculated. You don't accidentally, paint unbuttoned buttons. It's entirely intentional. And what he's coming in is he's coming in angry, hot to trot, angry about, 5 people were murdered yesterday. What are you going to do about it? I don't even have time to button up my suit. That's how much I don't care. That's how much this isn't about me. This is about us. And total propaganda. It's like we don't know that he actually didn't have the time to shave or to button up his suit. If you're about to confront the governor, you probably would button up your suit. But, this in an interesting way is just as much an idealization. It's just, he is being idealized for not caring. He's being idealized for his big head and his pointy hands and his incredible intelligence and rationalism, so much rationalism that it leads to fury, as opposed to, the other way around, which never really works.
Right.
And that's just how right he is. That there's a privilege to being able to have the time to button your damn buttons, and we're out of time.
Right.
So you just kind of end up with an incredibly striking and powerful moment that feels immediate and feels urgent, but is entirely planned down to the button, for a specific political agenda. And that's art. It's like that. Any painting is speaking to its moment probably as powerfully. And you didn't have to live there to get it. It helps to learn a little bit more about the history, but the history is there to speak to a very human moment that you can most likely relate to.
Right. All right. Well, speaking of a human moment and something obviously that has moved me, I definitely want to talk about Watson and the Shark before we have to go. So we've got a little bit of time left here. So let me pull that up. Here we go. All right. So as I mentioned, there are 3 different versions of this, which of course astounded me when I found out that there was more than one. And
they're huge.
And the one in Washington, D.C. and the one at the MFA, those ones are bigger. The one at Detroit is like, it's more of a vertical sort of thing. It's a little longer, which actually is really good for when you're a fangirl like me and you want to get that painting as your phone cover. So if you can see in my little box here, you see my phone. Yeah, I have Watson and the Shark as my phone cover. So sorry. Anyway, but let's talk. Let's talk about this.
Okay.
Ask me something. Let's talk. Oh my God. Let's talk to the people. Let's ask them. People out there, look at this painting. All right. This is the original one in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. We can go into the slight differences and things like that real quick, but I want you to just take a look at this and just, I guess shouting out in the chat here. what are things that strike you about this? What do you see?
Well,
Oh,
yeah, I'll say.
yes. Someone sees distress. Yes, I would certainly agree with that. What else? What is happening? The most striking item is the naked body. Yes.
Yeah, I agree. It's always it's weirdly surprising.
Mm-hmm. Because you almost wonder, like, where are his clothes? Like, maybe he took them off to go for a swim, but also, what is he doing?
It's such a moment of high drama.
Mm-hmm.
Like this is a painting where in the next second, something's gonna happen. There's
Yeah.
an incredible like pregnancy to the drama here that just
Mm.
feels unsustainable. And so to watch something, it's like in the like Hakusai's The Great Wave. It's like it's about to
Oh, yeah.
crash. Like there's no getting out of the fact that there's going to be something that happens, and that
Right.
tension can be really powerful.
So let's see. Judith is asking, is it just to represent his innocence and the violence of the scene? So what's interesting about this piece, this was commissioned by Watson, right? Of Watson and the Shark. And this is a story that he relayed to Copley of this shark attack that actually happened to him when he was 14 years old. So there's that little clue. And I mean, that doesn't look like a 14-year-old boy, but we'll continue to talk. So let's see.
Doesn't look like a shark either, but
Doesn't, hey, I mean, yeah. And you would think, I mean, he probably wasn't spending much time out on the ocean, looking for a shark. And yeah, like, I wonder, this always reminds me of, like, all those memes that are always like the Renaissance portraits of cats. And they're like, have you ever seen a cat and the cat's face is like all messed up and everything? It's like that. It cracks me up every time. Let's see. Josiah says, oh, his hand reaches to the guy aiming for the shark. Yep. Like, there's all sorts of things. What strikes me always about this, like Tamar said, this high drama. And, when I started to learn about this, and Tamar was just talking about how, these painters in this time period were looking at the painters before them. So if you were paying attention to what I was talking about before, this painting is done in 1778. That is 4 years after Copley leaves Boston. He has completed his European tour. And so this whole scene looks like those Renaissance paintings and all of that, with all the bodies around it, doing all these various things. And there are many articles and books and everything that pull out like the faces on some of these images and put them right up next to, like, sculptures or other paintings and things that could have been found in Italy or France when he went on his tour. And so looking at, how he's just, taking them and utilizing all of that in this work, but taking it to a place where it's not a religious painting.
Mm-hmm.
And yet it looks like one.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the subject of it is really interesting. And let's see what else. We have a triangulated focus. Watson, who's the guy in the water, the shark, and the harpoon.
Who needs no introduction?
Right, exactly. There he is. Good looking fella. What I always laugh because the National Gallery one, yeah, he looks like he has like an evil mustache, and he's like, I'm coming after you, Watson. It's just so funny. But the yeah. Oh, after 10 minutes of that, you realize there are other guys. Yes, there are other guys. After you've seen, like, the first time I saw this, my eyes went obviously to the shark, right to the shark. But then, yep, I'm noticing, why is this dude naked? Like, what happened? Did the shark eat his clothes? What we do know is if you look closely at the bottom corner there, his right leg has already been severed by the shark.
Oh.
And he has a peg leg, or, you know, a prosthetic or something, you know, an 18th century equivalent. And like, that's a known fact about Watson. And so, you know, he has this painting commission, but what I found out later, so of course I'm obsessed with this painting, right? And I'm trying to find any way to connect it to my colonial life here at the Boston Tea Party Ships and Museum. And for many years it was just a stretch, and I was like, oh, but it's Copley, it's the same guy, he's involved in the story, it's okay. What I found out later was that Watson is Brooke Watson, who was a future mayor of London. But more importantly, he was one of the dignitaries that welcomed enslaved poetess Phyllis Wheatley in London when she was seeking publishers for her book of poetry, which ultimately arrived here in Boston aboard the ship Dartmouth, right next to the East India Company tea. Like, come on, like, I couldn't have written a better story. Like, oh my God, so good. But yeah, Judith is saying, yeah, the Boston version with the lips. Here we go. Let's take a look. There he is. Look at that. And so you can see now, of course, these are images pulled from, you know, ye old internet, right? And so the coloring might be slightly off than what you might see in person, but there is a difference in the coloring of the shark. You know, his evil mustache has gone away. He put on a fresh coat of lip gloss, and, you know, there is still a lot of the same detailing. And, you know, like, I've sat with Tamar on that bench, you know, at the MFA, and just pointing things out to her. Some of my favorite details: the guy with the harpoon, his shoe, that buckle has a shine to it. When you're sitting in that gallery, there is a shine to it. There is a shine on that harpoon. If you look closely, some of the neck handkerchiefs that some of these gentlemen are wearing, the detailing on them, there's plaids, there's lines, there's all this stuff, which if you look at the other works by Copley, clothing was one of his best things, you know? And so for him to put that kind of detail in these guys on this boat, in this dramatic scene, but also make it fashion, you know, like, it's amazing. You know, I love this painting so much. And, you know, it is one of the reasons why I looked into Copley. And it is one of the reasons why I then, you know, as we were learning, you know, the complex and convoluted tale of the Boston Tea Party, and finding out that he married into the Clark family, that he was actually involved in our event, you know, that made it easier for me to start to understand his life, you know, and to, and then to start to look, like, wanting to know, yeah, what happened to him after he left London. And, you know, as you said earlier, that's sometimes all it takes is finding that piece that pulls you in, and then wanting to know more about it. Like, you know, at the beginning of this night, I was saying that, you know, your podcast is an invaluable tool for me. And I'm not just saying that because I love you and you're one of my dearest friends. Like, I used to be a little more nervous about talking about art, but I am now one of those people that will strike up conversations with strangers in front of paintings in art museums. Like, if they're saying something, or if they kind of, you know, if they're like, oh, I know, right? Like, look at the shark, right? He's crazy. You know, like, I've had many conversations with people in front of this painting.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they think I'm crazy, but
no, look, I
love it. It's so good.
So there are just two quick things that I wanted to respond to. One is that, you know, I know that we're talking about, like, the shark, you know, and in these terms, and, you know, the idea of, like, throwing a fresh coat of lippy on the, you know, I mean, I just want to put it out there that it's okay to talk about art like that. that we have a tendency to worry that those kinds of observations, it's like if you're drawn to something, if you're drawn to a painting like this, part of what you're drawn to is how weird that shark looks.
Mm-hmm.
And as we've just spent so much energy putting into the portrait of Samuel Adams, these little details are intentional and they matter, so it's like, it's really interesting that like the size of a painting or like things that you think don't count if you are, if you are uneducated looking at a painting and you think like, wow, it's big. And that's all I can add to this conversation.
Right.
The size actually is really important. Like where would this painting have fit? Like, would it have fit in someone's living room? Would it have only fit on a museum wall?
Mm-hmm.
All of this actually ties very deeply into, again, its own contemporary resonance and why it mattered in its moment, which is art history 101. It's like, that's why we care. Like, why did it matter in its own moment? And so the fact that Copley had probably never seen a shark matters.
Yeah.
And it matters for his story. It matters for the story of the painting, and it matters in the way that we receive it as an audience in its moment or looking back on it. And so to be drawn to something about it that seems off or silly or weird, like those shark lips, it's like, it's a perfectly valid observation. And if it is fun, if it makes looking at a painting more fun, more power to you, because it's making you more comfortable in interacting with the painting itself. And so I just want to be like, it's not disrespectful, and it doesn't kind of like brand you as somebody who like isn't supposed to be talking about art because we're talking about lipstick on a shark. Come on. It all folds into why it matters. And just one last quick thing just about Copley in general is you're looking at these, sorry, siren outside. If you're looking at the little details that make it seem so present, like the luster on the harpoon, or the buckle of the shoe. This is why Copley mattered in his moment and how he changed the shape of portraiture going forward. Because if you are at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and you just go up one floor, the first thing you see is John Singer Sargent's portrait of the daughters of Edward Darley Boyd. And that is a portrait that takes everything that we've just talked about with Samuel Adams and pushes it so intensely into the next century, because you are suddenly looking at girls, and you can Google the painting later for your own edification. But it's like, talk about somebody who doesn't have time to button his shirt. I mean, this is a teenager whose face is in shadow because she's not looking at you, because she doesn't want her portrait painted. Right. I mean, how is that an affirmation of class and steps? It's like, that is who this woman, this girl is. And his ability, again, so Sargent kind of looking at Copley, and the way that the light captures things and the way that it feels so immediate is just, it's a really poignant observation about what makes this painting so beautiful, because that really carries through into being in the moment of the portrait's life as it's being lived. And that, that changes everything. That is how you can be both speaking to your audience and timeless.
Absolutely. But, if anyone in the Boston area wants to go see this painting, they want somebody to go with them, I'm your girl. Just, send me an email here at the museum. I'm more than happy to meet you at the MFA, and we can walk around the Art of the Americas wing together and look at all this stuff. But Tamar, thank you so much for joining us tonight. So I think we've certainly gone way over our time tonight. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to email us here at the museum. You can get in touch with us through our Facebook page or anything like that. And if there's any specific questions for Tamar, you can get with her through her own website, thelonelypalette.com. And, be sure to check her out wherever you find your podcasts, and also check out Hub and Spoke, which is an independent podcast collective of which The Lonely Palette is a founding member. And if you find you like The Lonely Palette, you will certainly enjoy their slate of mind-expanding, Boston-centric podcasts. So, and I know you might be thinking, well, I don't know, what piece of art. Tamar has so many episodes listed. You will find at least one piece that pulls you in. And then you can start listening to other stuff.
Start with the one that you want to listen to, and go from there. They're not in any particular order. And if there's one painting that's like, oh, I love that painting. Oh, Watson and the Shard. Well, not that one, but the way that Kelly feels about Watson and the Shard, I'm sure you feel that way about another painting. And if I've happened to have done an episode on it, listen to that one first.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, please check it out. You will not be sorry. I promise. And of course, don't forget to follow us on our social media channels and check out our website for all of your Boston Tea Party needs. And we want to thank you for joining us for tonight's Tea Talk presentation. We will be taking a bit of a summer break from our live presentations, but we plan to return in the fall with all new topics. And in the meantime, you should check out our Tea Talks archives for more on the myths, the truths, and the untold stories of the Boston Tea Party. And all of our previous presentations are available for download at virtual.bostonteapartyship.com. Hey, there's me. Look at that.
Hey.
Now, if you enjoyed tonight's webinar and are looking for more information regarding John Singleton Copley, I would highly recommend the book that I mentioned a couple times, Harvard professor Jane Kamensky's A Revolution in Color. And it is available on our online store at shop.bostonteapartyship.com, in addition to many, many other goods. I know you'll go there looking for the Copley book, but you'll probably buy lots of other things. Of course, a huge selection of tea and everything else you might need. So thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we will see you soon. Good night, everybody.
Good night.